It was a Tuesday, but I wouldn't have remembered that if not for the way everything else was so ordinary. The sky had that soft, overcast gray that makes the curtains glow with an even kind of sadness. I had just folded the dish towel and walked into the pantry to fetch the flour. Nothing was out of place. The kettle hummed faintly behind me, warming water I didn't remember setting. My slippers scuffed softly against the tiles as I came back into the hallway. That narrow space between the pantry door and the kitchen island. The place I always paused for just a moment to listen to the house breathe. That's when I heard her. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Slipped through the kitchen, air like steam from the kettle, soft curling, and just hot enough to scald. She eats too much. 3 words, not even said with anger. Fact. It's like an observation you'd make about the weather or the way the mail hadn't arrived yet. A judgment folded neatly into a whisper. I didn't move. Not even an inch. The bag of flour in my arms grew heavier, though, as if her words had seeped into it. My fingers stayed curled around the paper, but the silence inside me changed. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a glass shatters, not while it's breaking, but just after, when everyone is looking at the floor. I hadn't realized how still I was until the sound of her spoon tapping against a bowl pulled me back. The smell of oatmeal drifted through the air, sweetened with brown sugar. She hummed softly, that tuneless way she did when she was pleased with herself. I imagined her tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, standing in that pale blue housecoat she wore when she wasn't expecting company. But I was there. I was always there. Just not in the ways she seemed to notice. I didn't confront her. I didn't say a word. I simply turned as quietly as I could and placed the flour on the counter. My hands moved automatically, measuring, sifting, mixing, but something behind my eyes stayed frozen in that hallway. In the pause, in the unkindness that wasn't even meant to be heard. She eats too much. I wondered for a moment if she meant it literally. If the morning bowls of porridge, the slices of fruit, the quiet cup of tea, if those were indulgences to her, or maybe it wasn't about food at all. Maybe it was the space I took up. It's the way I moved through my kitchen. It's a familiarity I had with the drawers, the rhythm of the house. It's a fridge magnet still holding up photos from 10 years ago. Maybe she meant that I lived too much, that my presence was too steady, that I hadn't folded neatly into the role of background silence, the way she hoped I would. I stirred the batter slower than usual. The spoon made that soft scraping sound against the metal bowl, and I watched the way it pulled tiny whirlpools into the center. It calmed me, in a strange way, to focus on something as unoffended as flour. Lena never greeted me that morning. When I stepped into the kitchen fully, she had already slipped out to the front room, phone in hand, fingers dancing lightly across the screen. Her oatmeal bowl was half finished, left sitting on the counter, the spoon resting against the rim. Like a thought abandoned mid-sentence, I washed the bowl. Not because I had to, not because I wanted to, just because it was there, and because routine has a way of swallowing pain if you let it. But from that moment on, something inside me changed. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand revenge or outrage. It was quieter than that. A kind of watching began. A new kind of listening. I started noticing the way she never looked directly at me unless my son was in the room. The way she moved just slightly slower when I needed to pass. The way her compliments always had a thread of something sour running through them before. I might have brushed those things off. I would have told myself she was tired, distracted, adjusting. But now, I didn't explain them away. I let them speak. Because once someone names you too much, you start to measure how little they think you're worth. And quietly, without telling anyone, not even myself, I began to remember every little thing she'd said before that I didn't catch. Every glance, every pause, every time she made me feel like a guest in a home that used to carry my name on the bills. That Tuesday wasn't extraordinary, but it marked the beginning of something. It's the end of my softness, perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of my silence becoming sharper. Not loud, just sharp enough to notice. It wasn't always like this. I try to remind myself of that, especially on quiet evenings when the light dims just enough to soften memory's edges. I think back to the first time Amir brought her home a late autumn afternoon, leaves clinging to the trees like secrets not ready to fall. He had called ahead, his voice light but measured, and told me he was bringing someone for dinner. Not a friend. Not a coworker. Someone. I remember opening the door and seeing her standing just behind him, hands clasped in front of her like she was afraid to knock. Lena. That was the name she offered with a small, nervous smile and a voice that barely reached above the rustle of her coat. She was polite, almost too polite, and so very quiet. Eyes downcast, her words careful. She kept brushing her hair behind one ear, like it gave her something to do while thinking of what to say. I saw a kind of sweetness in her then, or maybe I wanted to see it. Something gentle, shy. I imagined she would warm over time, that she just needed space to breathe, to feel safe. I invited her to help me fold laundry one Saturday, and though she agreed, she folded each shirt with a distance I couldn't quite reach through. We cooked once, side by side in the kitchen, and while the smells of turmeric and garlic wrapped around us, I remember thinking it was the first time the silence between us felt less awkward and more like coexistence. She laughed once, softly, when I spilled a pinch of salt, and I held on to that sound for days. Back then, I believed we would grow into each other. I told myself the awkwardness would pass, that she was simply trying to figure out her place in a house already lived in. I tried to be welcoming, maybe even too welcoming. Set the table just so, included her in conversations, asked her opinions on curtain fabric and chutney spice. She always smiled, but it was the kind of smile that came with a pause. Not like she was checking the temperature of the air before stepping in. But it was Amir I started noticing more. He changed in ways too subtle to name at first. He didn't tease me in that familiar way when I overcooked the rice. Started clearing his throat before disagreeing with me, as if needing permission to speak. When I asked him one evening if he still wanted his favorite Sunday dessert, he looked at Lena before answering. She smiled that same small polite smile and said he was watching his sugar. And so he said no, it wasn't dramatic. There were no arguments, no slammed doors. It's just a slow rewiring of the house. A shift in how words landed, how laughter echoed, how rooms felt fuller when they were empty of me. I caught him once, standing in the hallway just outside the kitchen. Lena was in the living room, flipping through a magazine without much interest. He wasn't looking at her. Kay was looking down at his hands as if they'd done something he didn't recognize. When I asked him what was wrong, he blinked, shook his head, and smiled that same kind of pause-filled smile Lena used. It was then I began to understand, not fully, that something had taken root. A hesitation in him that hadn't been there before. A quiet recalibration of who he was allowed to be when she was near. Lena never told him to pull back from me, at least not with words. But some people don't need language to build walls. They just start decorating rooms you thought were yours, moving furniture in their heads, until you realize you've become a guest in a space you once memorized by heart. So no, it wasn't always like this. And maybe that's what made it worse. The kindness I gave her at the beginning wasn't forced. It was real. She just never reached back for it. And Amir, my son, he reached for her instead, quietly, without looking back. It's the little things you start to notice first. The things that feel too minor to mention, too quiet to accuse. Like coming into the kitchen and finding the spice jars turned just slightly, their labels facing outward with unnatural precision. I used to keep them by feel. Cumin beside coriander, cinnamon near cloves. Not alphabetized, but memorized. My hands knew them like muscle memory. But slowly they started to shift, always after I'd stepped away. I never saw her do it, but I knew there was a morning I remember it because the sun had come in sharp and golden through the east window, lighting the countertop in that forgiving way that makes even dust feel holy when I washed a plate after breakfast. Just one, My own. I rinsed it, dried it, set it aside. Nothing out of the ordinary. But 5 minutes later, I heard water running again. Kay, and when I peeked around the corner, there she was. Lena rewashing it. Same plate, same sponge, same movement, only slower. As if to be certain, she didn't say anything. Just hummed a soft tune, tuneless, really, like the kind of sound people make when they want to seem casual. Her back was to me, her posture relaxed. But I felt something in the air, a message, invisible but clear. She didn't trust how I'd done it. Or maybe, more precisely, she didn't want to trust it. She needed to make the space hers by undoing mine. She never raised her voice, never called me out. If anything, she was overly polite. Thanked me for dinner, for errands, for folding towels she never asked me to. But there was always a distance in her eyes, a delay before her smile. It never quite landed, like she was performing the idea of kindness, not the real thing. I began to feel myself shrinking, little by little, not physically, of course, but in the way I moved. I'd hesitate before opening drawers. I'd ask before using the oven, even though it had been mine long before she arrived. Sometimes I'd step into the kitchen and feel her glance, not hostile, but alert, like she was assessing the air, measuring how much space I was taking up, and I in turn began to apologize without speaking. My hands moved quieter. My footsteps softened. She never told me to do less, but she did enough to make me believe I should. There's a particular kind of tired that sets in when you're constantly adjusting yourself around someone who pretends not to notice. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, but it wears at you. You start second-guessing where you left things. It's wondering if you're imagining the shift in the room's energy. It's telling yourself it's just a difference in personality. A harmless mismatch. But then the coffee grounds are moved to a higher shelf, one I don't reach as easily. The hand towel I left folded is replaced with one of hers, slightly newer, slightly brighter. My teacup disappears for 3 days before returning, placed just off-center in the cabinet. And when I mention it casually, she tilts her head and says she hasn't seen it. She's not cruel. That would be easier in a way. This is something else. A quiet sanding down of who I am. Not enough to wound, just enough to erase slowly. She's rewriting the house in her image, okay? And on the paragraph she's editing out one word at a time. I tried in the beginning to give her grace. Told myself she was adjusting, that she meant no harm, that it was just two women learning to coexist. But lately, I've begun to suspect that Lena doesn't believe in sharing space. Not truly. She believes in control, even if it's dressed in softness. She believes in redoing what I've done, not because it's wrong, but because it wasn't hers. And somewhere in that quiet rearranging of towels and spices, she's been rearranging me too. I used to walk into this kitchen like it knew me. Now I enter like a guest, waiting for permission I never used to need. When my husband died, the house felt quiet in places I hadn't noticed were ever loud. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with grief's first wave. Not the crying kind, not even the aching kind. It's just a softer hush. The radio stayed off more often. The clatter of shared laughter disappeared. Fridge opened fewer times a day. I kept myself steady through the small things. Grocery lists, folded receipts, a lined notepad on the kitchen counter with penciled reminders in my own handwriting. It gave shape to the days my pension came in steadily. Modest, but enough. Along with the savings we'd kept for just-in-case moments. After he passed, that became the quiet structure behind everything. I didn't think of it as mine exactly. Just the thread holding it all together. Managed the groceries out of habit, not out of control. I liked knowing what was needed, what was running low, what brands tasted like memory. Lena never asked for the card. That's the part I keep coming back to. She didn't demand it or even suggest it strongly. One morning, she offered to pick up a few things since she was already headed out. I handed the card over without hesitation. She smiled, not too much, not too little, and said it would save time. I remember nodding. It felt natural. It's helpful even. It started with small items, Milk, apples, cereal. Nothing unusual. She brought back the receipt, folded, tucked neatly into the bag like a courtesy. I didn't read it the first few times. Why would I? There was trust in the air back then, or at least something pretending to be it. But one afternoon, I noticed. The receipt left on the table beside a shopping bag. It was longer than usual. I unfolded it without thinking. Ported lotions, a wedge of manchego cheese from a store I'd never been to, a lavender-infused cleaning spray. None of these things made it into our kitchen, or if they had, they were tucked somewhere I wouldn't look. I told myself there might be an explanation. Maybe she had gifted something. Maybe she returned it. Maybe I placed the receipt in the drawer and didn't speak of it. But I started looking. Quietly. The next time she went out, I watched the bags more closely. Labeled containers, branded sauces I never used. It's a sleek little glass bottle of something herbal that disappeared before I could see it again. I checked the email account linked to the loyalty card, the one I had set up years ago to track rewards. There it was, a message welcoming Lena by name. She had registered herself using my card number. Her name sat there like it belonged. I stared at it longer than I meant to. I didn't confront her, didn't ask questions. Something in me had already learned that her answers would be smooth, like stones polished by water to round to hold on to. And maybe, if I'm honest, I didn't want the performance of it. It's the kind eyes, the soft denial, it's the smile wrapped in civility, so I just watched. I kept my routines, still made tea in the mornings, still tidied the shelves, still jotted down what was needed. But I stopped handing over the card. She didn't ask. Maybe she felt the shift, or maybe she thought I hadn't noticed. That I was still somewhere between grateful and blind. Sometimes I wonder how much someone has to take before it counts as theft. Not legally, maybe, but in spirit. When someone uses your generosity to draw their own borders to write their name into systems that once held only yours. I don't think Lena wanted money. Not exactly. She wanted access, control, dressed as convenience. She didn't need to hold the reins tightly. She just needed me to stop noticing they'd slipped from my hands. But I noticed, and I wrote it down. Not with ink, but with memory. A kind of accounting that didn't need spreadsheets or arguments. Just quiet pages stacking up, one receipt at a time. The house had grown quieter in ways that crept up slowly. It wasn't sudden like someone turning down the volume on life. It was more like dust gathering in the corners, unnoticed at first until you catch it in the right light. Meals shrunk. Plates came back to the sink with more left over than usual. The kettle boiled less. The hallway stayed empty longer. Even the sound of drawers opening seemed softer, like the house had learned to tiptoe. Lena spoke to me less. Was something I started counting without meaning to. Noticing the way her footsteps passed mine without pause, the way she answered in single syllables, or not at all, unless Amir was home. When he entered the room, her voice lifted as if she just remembered she could be warm. Her eyes softened, her smile arrived not for me, but for him. And suddenly, everything looked fine again, or fine enough to pass inspection. I became background noise, the kind people forget to acknowledge but would notice if it disappeared. One afternoon, while wiping the counter clean, I heard her voice travel down the hallway. She was on the phone, speaking low but clear. It's a kind of voice that didn't care if it was overheard or simply forgot to wonder who might be listening. She laughed, a small, sharp sound, and said, "She's always in the kitchen. It's like she's waiting to be served." I don't know what part of that hit harder, the words, or the ease with which she said them. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, just casual dismissal, like describing a pet that wandered underfoot. I stood still, my cloth damp in my hand, the scent of lemon cleaner rising up between us like something sour and artificial. That night I roasted chicken, quietly, out of habit. Amir had always liked it with rosemary and garlic. I carved it carefully, plated it with the same attention I'd given for years, but the table was quiet. Lena sat scrolling through her phone. Amir nodded his thanks but didn't look up. Number one said anything about the flavor or the care or the way I'd laid napkins neatly beside each dish. Dinner passed like a cold breeze barely touching us. The silence wasn't new. But that night it felt heavier. A meal laid out for people who had already left, in spirit if not in body. Lena didn't make eye contact once. Amir told a short story about a client at work and she laughed. I smiled quietly, but no one noticed. I wondered if he heard the comment earlier. If he had walked by and let it settle into his skin the way I had, or maybe he didn't hear it at all. Or maybe, and this was the part that stayed with me long after the plates had been cleared, maybe he had heard it and chosen not to care. There's a strange kind of ache in realizing your own child has grown comfortable with your absence, even while you're still sitting at the table that night. I lay in bed with the light off and the hallway dim, listening to their muffled voices from the other room. I couldn't make out the words, just tones, soft laughter, a question, a reply, the kind of conversation people have when they feel entirely at home. And I realized I no longer did. The kitchen, once mine in every quiet detail, now felt borrowed. The scent of spices, once familiar, now belonged to her hands. My apron, the one with the faded stitching near the pocket, had been replaced on the hook with a newer, cleaner one. Not mine. It's hard to explain what it feels like to be gently erased. Not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. The way a shadow disappears when the sun moves, not because the shadow did anything wrong, but because it was never meant to stay. It was the kind of evening where the air feels too still, like something in the walls is holding its breath. I moved through the kitchen slowly, my steps quiet on the tiled floor. I wasn't even particularly hungry, just wanted something small. A few spoonfuls of yogurt, maybe some fruit, something to ground me. When I opened the fridge, the light buzzed on with its usual faint hum, casting everything in that cold, artificial glow. I reached instinctively for the yogurt tucked behind. The milk carton, the one I always bought for myself, plain, unsweetened, simple. My hand paused mid-reach. The container had been marked black marker. Thick letters, Lena. I blinked, confused for a moment. I turned the container in my hands, hoping maybe I'd read it wrong. But the letters were clear, intentional. Not Anne. Accident. Not a child's scribble. Her name, bold and possessive, claiming what I had once always thought of as shared. My eyes moved slowly across the shelves. That's when I saw the labels, thin strips of masking tape on the sides of Tupperware, the backs of containers, even on a small bag of almonds. Some marked Lena, others blank. The milk had nothing, but the oat creamer did. My shelf, her shelf. Silent borders drawn in ink and tape. It was subtle, but it changed the way I stood in that space. As if the kitchen no longer belonged to all of us, but had been quietly carved up into sections. I backed away from the fridge and closed the door gently, if not to disturb the new arrangement. The trash bin sat half full near the sink. I pressed the pedal and the lid opened with its usual sigh. Inside, near the top, I saw it, my cereal. The one I'd bought a week ago, unopened. The same brand I'd been eating for years. The box had been folded and crushed slightly, as if hurriedly disposed of. It wasn't even expired. I stared at it longer than I should have. The top still sealed. No note, no explanation. Just gone. I found Amir in the living room, scrolling through something on his phone. The glow lit his face in soft blue, making him look younger, almost like the boy I used to pull in for dinner by the collar of his t-shirt. I asked carefully if something was wrong. If there was a reason things in the kitchen had changed. He didn't look up right away. Just sighed and rubbed the spot between his eyebrows, that familiar motion, the one he did when he didn't. Want to talk about something? He mumbled something about boundaries. Said Lena liked to keep things organized. And it wasn't a big deal. That word boundaries, it didn't sound like him. Sounded like a borrowed term, something picked up from an article or a therapist's office, or maybe from Lena herself. It sat heavily between us. I wanted to ask what line I had crossed, what space I had invaded. What part of my own life had become too large for their comfort? But I didn't. I just nodded once and sat on the edge of the armchair, hands folded, too tightly in my lap. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I kept turning the word over in my mind. Boundaries. It used to be that I was the boundary. The one who protected, who made rules, who taught him what to trust. I was home. I was the fixed point he turned toward when everything else shifted. But now, I was a line someone didn't want crossed. The kitchen had once been the heart of this house, warm, chaotic, full of scents and noise. Now it felt like a chessboard. Her side, my side, marked, measured, controlled. It wasn't just about yogurt or cereal. It was about the way I'd been shifted out of frame, quietly, without confrontation. The decisions weren't made with me, but around me. The labels weren't just physical, they were emotional too. Dividers between who belonged and who was tolerated. And what haunted me most wasn't that. Lena had started to draw those lines. It was that Amir had handed her the pen. I wasn't looking for anything important, just a pair of scissors. The ones with the blue handles and the little nick on the edge from when I tried to open a stubborn package last winter. They were usually in the second drawer, the one no one ever calls by name, just the junk drawer, as if mess lives thereby. Right thought the scissors weren't on top, so I dug a little deeper, lifted a flashlight, a bent roll of tape, the faded instructions for a blender we no longer had. And they're tucked between two folded utility bills and an expired coupon. I found a small cluster of paper, receipts. Some were smudged, others crisp, folded twice, tucked deliberately. They weren't mine. I opened the top one first, an upscale grocery store, the kind with imported olive oils and fresh-cut flowers at the entrance. $1.42 on a bottle of rosewater facial mist. Another, a delivery note for a custom gift basket, $120. Addressed to someone I didn't recognize, sent with a handwritten card. At the bottom, in ink that had bled just slightly into the paper, a faint lipstick-marked dot, another receipt listed macarons from a French bakery halfway across the city. A dozen, in flavors too precious to pronounce properly. The date caught my eye. It was 3 days before Lena told me, with that polite, hushed voice, that we should watch our grocery spending, that indulgences weren't good for the household rhythm. Her words had been careful, like everything she said. But I had understood what she meant. I'd requested a small tin of almonds, just almonds, nothing extravagant. She'd sighed, said things were tight, that we didn't need extras, and so I had let it go. But these papers didn't lie. They listed the extras, the indulgences, the choices. And her name appeared at the bottom more than once, attached to loyalty points, or a digital signature. Not mine. I sat back on the floor, the receipts spread out like fallen leaves. My breath stayed quiet, but my chest felt heavy. Not with shock, not even with betrayal. Exactly. It was something slower, duller, like heat beginning to leave a room. I had been careful, modest. Even after my husband passed, I never thought of the pension or savings as mine alone. I cooked from scratch, chose store brand when I could, saved foil to reuse. I thought I was part of something shared, a house that worked because I carried part of the load, but it seemed Lena carried something else, a different set of rules. One for herself, another for me. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the ease, the comfort she had in using what I'd built while denying me the smallest of requests. How easily she could say no to me with her words while saying yes to herself with her actions. The almonds weren't expensive, but they were too much for me. I gathered the receipts into a neat pile, didn't tear them, didn't confront, placed them in an old envelope and slid it back into the drawer deeper this time. Not hidden, just waiting. That evening, I said nothing. I made lentil soup and folded the napkins just so. Lena complimented the flavor lightly. Offhandedly, my son didn't look up from his phone. The same rhythm, the same silence, but something had shifted inside me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was the beginning of calculation. The soft click of something being counted. Not in dollars, but in respect. In space. In truth, I stopped thinking of her as someone I had to adjust around. I started measuring what had been taken. And what remained, I didn't plan it with any drama. There was no speech waiting in my throat, no trembling hands. Just a quiet, steady walk to the bank on a Tuesday morning. My handbag tucked under my arm, my footsteps slow and unremarkable. I stood in line behind a man asking about wire transfers, and a woman with a baby cradled to her chest. The clerk smiled at me like any other customer. I smiled back. I changed the PIN, canceled the old card, ordered a new one. It didn't feel like revenge. Felt like reclaiming the air in my lungs. Like opening a window in a room where no one realized the curtains had been drawn for too long. I came home the same way. I left quiet, purposeful. I chopped cucumbers for the salad, boiled potatoes. The soft rhythms of preparation helped pass the time until I heard the garage door open, Lena's voice floating in behind it. Amir's footsteps followed, heavier, dragging slightly like they always did when he was tired. I didn't greet them. Later that afternoon, I heard her in the kitchen. Cabinets opening, the sound of something set gently on the counter. Then a long pause. And finally, her voice not loud but sharp around the edges, asking if anyone else had trouble with the card. It had declined, she said, probably a glitch. Maybe the machine was faulty. I wiped my hands on a towel and told her softly that I hadn't used it that day. I offered no further explanation. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching. I held the gaze only for a second. Just enough. She didn't ask again. That evening the house shifted into a strange quiet. Not the passive kind I had grown used to, but something more pointed. Lena stayed in the living room with her phone. Amir lingered near her, asking if she needed anything. He didn't say much to me. Not even when I placed the serving dish on the table. Or when I excused myself early, claiming I wasn't that hungry. I ended up making toast. Just one slice. Buttered and plain. I sat with it at the far edge of the kitchen table, where the light from the window dipped into a golden slant. I could hear their plates clicking, the faint murmur of their conversation behind the wall. It didn't matter what they were saying, the silence between us said more. And strangely, it didn't hurt. Not the way it used to. There was something clean about it. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to please. I wasn't smoothing the edges or swallowing discomfort. I wasn't performing warmth for the sake of keeping peace. I was just sitting, and in that small, dim moment, I realized something. They had come to expect the giving. Not with gratitude, but with entitlement. They had mistaken my consistency for obligation, my presence for permission. The silence that night was colder than usual, but it belonged to me. It wasn't punishment, it wasn't strategy, it was space. It's a boundary drawn without tape, without ink. It's a decision made and carried through without explanation. Lena didn't look me in the eye as she washed her plate. Mir didn't ask how my day had gone. No one mentioned the card again. And I didn't need them to dot it. Rained the morning I left. Not a downpour, but the kind of gentle, continuous rain that turns the world soft and silver. The windows were already fogged at the corners when I woke up. I stood by the sink and watched the garden blur behind the glass. The rosemary bush bending slightly under the weight of it all. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet I had once worked. So hard to fill with the hiss of tea boiling, the clatter of plates, the hum of small routines. But that morning I let the silence stay. I didn't rush. Folded my sweater carefully, tucking it into the canvas bag I'd had since before Amir was born. I slipped a few pairs of socks in beside it, a tin of almonds I'd kept hidden in, the cupboard behind the tea bags, and my softest scarf, the one he used to borrow when he had a cold years ago. Before I zipped the bag, I sat down at the table. The same table I'd wiped clean 1,000 times. I picked up a notepad, the one we used to keep by the fridge, and wrote down every grocery item I knew they relied on. It's the brand of milk Lena preferred. Amir's toothpaste. It's the type of rice that never clumped. I even wrote the days. The bins went out, though I doubted they'd remember to look. I placed the note beside the keys on the counter. Both sat there like quiet offerings, not angry. Final dot, the umbrella waited by the door. It opened with a soft snap, familiar in my hand. I stepped outside and didn't look back. No shouting, no tears, no dramatic exit. It's just the light tap of rain on fabric and the slow, certain click of my shoes on the wet pavement. The street was empty. It's the world somehow cleaner as I walked. I thought of all the meals I had made with hands that never asked for thanks. The thousands of steps between the stove and the table. The way I had learned everyone's preferences without being told. The way I had been erased one small favor at a time. They would wake late, I imagined. Find the list and the keys and say nothing. Maybe they'd glance at each other, confused. Maybe Lena would sigh. Amir would rub the space between his eyes. But they wouldn't call. Not right away. They'd wait, expecting I'd return like always. But I wouldn't let them learn to boil their own water, to choose their own bread. Let them remember too late which brand of tea didn't turn bitter. When steeped too long. Let them argue over who forgot to buy salt, who let the milk spoil, who missed the garbage pickup. Let them sit in the silence I once filled and wonder why it feels colder now. That morning, the rain didn't chill me. It wrapped itself around my coat gently, as though it understood. As though it too had tired of being taken for granted. I didn't leave out of anger. I left because I had given everything that could be given quietly, and now it was time for the quiet to belong to me.